The fine white dust settling on the floorboards of the east wing was the first sign that the restoration of the estate was unraveling. I remember rubbing the chalky residue between my thumb and index finger, looking up at the freshly plastered ceiling of what was supposed to be our new son's bedroom. The hairline fracture branching across the surface made no sense. I had reinforced those joists myself 3 weeks earlier. I am an architectural restorer by trade. I do not make structural miscalculations. Yet there it was, a deliberate compromise in the integrity of my own home, just days before the county social worker was scheduled to conduct the final home inspection for our adoption. To understand the weight of that dust, you have to understand the geography of the Oakhaven estate and the heavy, suffocating blanket of the family trust that governed it. I married into this property. My wife, Clara, grew up on these 90 acres of commercial orchards and historic outbuildings, sharing the space with her older sister, Yvonne. When Clara and I met, Oakhaven was hemorrhaging money. Its main colonial structure was sinking into its own foundation, and the agricultural revenue was barely covering the property taxes. I spent 7 years pouring my own savings and my professional expertise into saving the venue. We converted the main barns into a high-end event space and painstakingly restored the residential wings. Clara and I lived in the East Wing, while Yvonne occupied the executive suite in the modernized West Wing. Yvonne did not contribute funds or labor to the restoration, but she possessed an unshakable belief in her inherent authority over the land. This belief was anchored in a peculiar clause of their grandfather's trust. The trust dictated that the primary controlling share of the estate's revenue and operational veto power would automatically transfer to the first grandchild of the new generation, to bear the grandfather's exact first and middle name, Harrison Vance. For years, that clause was a dormant piece of family trivia. Clara and I had struggled with infertility for a long time, enduring cycles of quiet grief that we kept entirely to ourselves. Yvonne, on the other hand, treated her future motherhood as a highly publicized inevitability. She had not yet found a partner, but she had loudly and repeatedly declared that her firstborn son would be named Harrison Vance. She had, in her own words, reserved the legal right to the legacy. It was a theoretical monopoly on the family's future, and Clara and I had never cared to challenge it. We just wanted a family. We didn't care about estate shares or executive control. Then came our breakthrough. After years of paperwork, interviews, and emotional exhaustion, Clara and I were finally matched with a 2-year-old boy whose biological parents had voluntarily relinquished their rights. He was a quiet, observant toddler who had already been in 3 temporary foster placements. When we began the legal process to finalize the adoption and choose his permanent name, Clara suggested Harrison. Not for the estate, and not for the trust. We chose it because Clara's grandfather, the original Harrison, was the only member of her family who had fully embraced me when I first arrived, with a truck full of tools and no money. He had been a man of immense warmth and quiet dignity. We wanted our son to carry that specific legacy of kindness. When we filed the preliminary adoption paperwork and the legal name change petition, the required public notice was mailed to the family trust's legal address. Yvonne intercepted it. The initial confrontation did not happen in a dramatic shouting match. It happened in the estate's greenhouse, where I was repairing a line of cast-iron radiators. Yvonne walked in, holding the legal notice between 2 fingers like it was contaminated. She did not ask about the boy. She did not congratulate us on finally becoming parents. She calmly informed me that we were legally prohibited from using the name Harrison because she had claimed it first. She spoke with the bizarre confidence of someone quoting a non-existent law, arguing that her verbal reservation of the name constituted a binding agreement. I explained calmly but firmly that you cannot copyright a human name, nor can you call dibs on a tribute to a shared grandfather. I told her that our son's identity was not a chess piece in her imaginary estate planning. Yvonne stared at me with a cold, hollow expression. She said that I was an outsider who had only married into the property to steal her inheritance, and that if we proceeded with naming the boy Harrison, she would ensure the county deemed our residence permanently unfit for child placement. I dismissed her threat as the desperate rattling of a narcissist losing her grip on a fictional throne. I should have taken her seriously, 2 weeks before the final inspection, small unexplainable hazards began appearing in our living quarters. A custom-fitted safety gate at the top of the stairs was suddenly loose, its mounting screws cleanly stripped. The hot water thermostat in the east wing was mysteriously dialed up to a scalding temperature. And then, the structural fracture in the nursery ceiling. I called Marcus, an independent structural engineer and a trusted colleague, to assess the ceiling. I needed an official report to prove I was addressing any potential issues before the social worker arrived. Marcus spent an hour in the crawl space above the nursery. When he came down, his expression was grim. He handed me a rusted, heavy-duty crowbar that did not belong to my tool set. He explained that someone had wedged the iron bar between the primary support beam and the main pressurized water pipe, applying just enough leverage to crack the plaster below and put critical stress on the plumbing. If the pipe had burst, it would have flooded the nursery, caused a catastrophic ceiling collapse and generated a public safety record that would have instantly disqualified our home for the adoption. I felt a cold rush of adrenaline. This was no longer a petty family dispute over a name. This was a calculated attempt to endanger our home and sabotage our adoption process. I realized my vulnerability. As a restorer, I was constantly moving heavy materials, pulling permits, and generating construction debris. If the county inspector saw a hazardous environment, Yvonne wouldn't even need to make an accusation. The environment would speak for itself, and my profession would be used as the excuse for my negligence. I did not confront Yvonne. Confrontation without leverage is just noise, and I needed absolute silence to gather my proof. The estate was massive, and during the venue renovations, I had installed a comprehensive network of low-profile site security cameras to monitor material deliveries and protect expensive architectural salvage from theft. The system was entirely hardwired into a secure server in my basement workshop. Yvonne knew the cameras existed in the public event spaces, but she did not know I had recently expanded the network to cover the exterior access points of the residential wings, specifically to monitor the fragile foundation work we were completing near the east wall. I spent 3 nights auditing the encrypted footage. I systematically traced the timestamps corresponding to the days when the safety gate was stripped, the water heater was altered, and the ceiling was compromised. The chain of evidence was undeniable, but it was the final video that solidified the narrative. The footage from Tuesday afternoon showed Yvonne bypassing the main pathways and approaching the exterior utility access door of our wing. She was wearing heavy gardening gloves. She used a master skeleton key, an antique brass key she had reported lost 2 years prior, to unlock the service panel. The camera captured a clear, unobstructed view of her, carrying the rusted crowbar into the crawlspace access point. More importantly, the audio feed from the courtyard camera caught a phone conversation she had immediately after exiting. She was speaking to Arthur, a real estate attorney who occasionally handled the venue's commercial contracts. She was instructing Arthur to draft a formal grievance to the County Child Welfare Office, citing my alleged reckless storage of construction materials and structural instability, specifically requesting that a cease and desist order be placed on our home exactly 1 day before the adoption hearing. She was building a paper trail to legally block my son from coming home, entirely so she could protect a name she wanted to use for a hypothetical child she did not yet have. I knew that presenting this footage in a casual setting would allow her to deflect, play the victim, or claim the video was taken out of context. I needed a venue where her actions would carry immediate, irreversible administrative consequences. The opportunity arrived on the morning of the estate's quarterly board of directors meeting. Due to the size of the venue's operations, Oakhaven was legally structured as an LLC, overseen by a 5-person board that included Clara, Yvonne, me, and 2 external financial trustees. By trust mandate, any executive grievance regarding the safety or liability of the property had to be formally logged during these meetings. Yvonne had strategically placed a motion on the agenda titled Residential Safety and Insurance Liability in the East Wing. We gathered in the main boardroom of the converted barn. The 2 external trustees sat at the far end of the long oak table, shuffling through their financial packets. Clara sat beside me, her hands folded tightly in her lap. We had barely slept. Our son's final home inspection was scheduled for 3 o'clock that same afternoon, and Yvonne's attorney, Arthur, was sitting quietly in the corner, ready to file the grievance that would halt the inspector at the gates. When it was her turn to speak, Yvonne stood up. She projected a deeply practiced aura of tragic concern. She handed a printed dossier to the trustees, outlining the alleged deteriorating conditions of our living quarters. She spoke about her deep, agonizing worry for the safety of any child placed in my care. She listed the stripped safety gate, the scalding water temperatures, and the cracked ceiling joists as proof of my negligence. She formally proposed a board resolution to revoke our residential permit on the estate, effectively rendering us homeless on paper just hours before our adoption was to be finalized. The trustees looked disturbed. One of them turned to me, adjusting his glasses, and asked if I had a structural counter-report to address these severe liabilities. I did not raise my voice. I opened my laptop and connected it to the boardroom's main projection screen. I told the board that I completely agreed with Yvonne's assessment that the East Wing had been subjected to severe, unacceptable safety hazards. I explained that as the property manager, I had a duty to investigate the root cause of this sudden liability. I clicked play on the first file. The room filled with the ambient sound of the courtyard. The crisp, high-definition footage appeared on the large screen, showing Yvonne looking over her shoulder before using the supposedly lost antique master key to unlock our private utility panel. One of the trustees frowned, leaning forward. Yvonne froze, her hand hovering over her dossier. I switched to the next file, recorded an hour later. The camera captured her emerging from the crawlspace, her clothes dusted with the exact white plaster that had fallen onto my nursery floor. She was holding the crowbar. I did not look at her. I addressed the trustees. I explained the exact mechanical leverage applied to the pressurized water pipe, presenting the signed affidavit from Marcus, the structural engineer, detailing how the pipe was manipulated to cause a slow, catastrophic ceiling failure. Finally, I played the audio file of her phone call in the courtyard. The acoustics of the stone walls had amplified her voice perfectly. The entire boardroom listened to her crisp, cold instructions to Arthur, detailing her plan to manufacture a child welfare hazard to stop the adoption and secure her exclusive claim to the name Harrison Vance. When the audio finished, there was no shouting. There was no dramatic music. There was only the low hum of the projector fan and a heavy, suffocating silence that pressed against the walls of the room. The trustees stared at the screen, then at the printed dossiers Yvonne had handed them, and finally at Yvonne herself. Arthur, her attorney, slowly closed his briefcase, the brass clasps clicking sharply in the quiet room. He stood up, muttered a brief apology to the trustees, and walked out of the building. He was a professional, and he knew when a client had just crossed the line from a civil dispute into malicious property damage and fraudulent legal reporting. Yvonne opened her mouth to speak, but her usual confidence had evaporated. She looked at the faces of the trustees, realizing that she had not just insulted her family, she had documented herself intentionally compromising the structural integrity of a multi-million-dollar commercial asset. In the eyes of the board, she was no longer a legacy heir. She was an uninsurable liability. One of the trustees, a retired judge with no patience for family theatrics, spoke first. He informed Yvonne that her motion was dismissed. He then formally moved to suspend her executive voting rights, pending a full legal review of her vandalism to the estate's infrastructure. Clara and I left the boardroom before the meeting was officially adjourned. We had a home inspection to prepare for. That afternoon, the county social worker arrived. She walked through the East Wing, checking the newly secured safety gates, measuring the water temperature, and admiring the freshly repaired and painted ceiling of the nursery. She found no hazards. She found a home that was safe, prepared, and quiet. 2 days later, we stood in a county courthouse and finalized the adoption. The judge stamped the paperwork, legally recognizing our son as Harrison Vance. We did not force Yvonne out of the estate entirely. The legal entanglement of the property made a clean break impossible in the short term. However, the board stripped her of her operational authority and her access keys. She still lives in the West Wing, but she is essentially a heavily monitored tenant in the empire she thought she owned. The grand commanding presence she once held over the property has vanished, replaced by a bitter, isolated quiet. I still wake up early to work on the estate. I still fix the radiators and repair the stonework. But the property feels different now. The weight of the trust no longer dictates our movements. We broke its hold by exposing the lengths to which it drove someone who worshipped legacy over human life. Yesterday morning, I was sitting on the front porch of our wing, drinking coffee and watching the sun rise over the orchards. Clara walked out, carrying Harrison. He had a small wooden toy hammer in his hand, a gift from my workshop. He waddled over to the porch railing and gently tapped it against the wood, mimicking my work. I watched him study the grain of the timber, completely unaware of the battles fought over his name, safe in the foundation we had built for him. The tranquility of that morning on the porch was a fragile, temporary structure. I should have known that a foundation built on a forced compromise is prone to shifting. For the first 4 months after Harrison's adoption, Oakhaven felt like a genuine sanctuary. We moved into the rhythm of new parenthood, balancing late-night feedings with the demands of the upcoming autumn wedding season. The estate was fully booked. The event spaces in the restored barns were generating the kind of revenue that promised long-term security for the trust, which meant security for our son. Yvonne remained in the West Wing, a silent ghost haunting her own ancestral home. We rarely saw her. She received her monthly shareholder dividends, but without her executive voting rights, she had no authority over the daily operations, the staff, or the property management. I assumed her silence was the bitter acceptance of defeat. I underestimated the patience of someone who views their own family as an obstacle to be dismantled. The first symptom of the new crisis was financial, not physical. It began in late October, just days before the largest, most lucrative event of the year, a 3-day corporate retreat booked by a major tech firm. Clara, who managed the estate's operational accounts, noticed a series of automated notifications from our primary insurance provider. Our commercial liability premiums for the venue had suddenly tripled overnight. When Clara called the broker to contest the hike, she was informed that a comprehensive independent risk assessment had been filed against Oakhaven LLC by a certified fire safety inspector. The report cited catastrophic electrical non-compliance in the main event barn. According to the document, the entire high-voltage grid powering the commercial kitchen and the climate control systems had been installed without proper permits and posed an immediate, critical fire hazard. If the grid was not completely replaced and recertified within 48 hours, our venue license would be suspended. I knew the electrical grid intimately. I had personally overseen its installation 2 years prior, working alongside licensed commercial electricians. We had pulled every permit, passed every county inspection, and exceeded every commercial code requirement. There was absolutely no basis for a catastrophic failure report. I asked Clara for a copy of the inspector's dossier. When she printed it out, I scanned the detailed schematics and the attached photographs. The photos showed severe thermal scoring on the main breaker panels and exposed, spliced wires hidden deep within the ventilation shafts. It looked like the amateur, dangerous work of a negligent contractor. But the panels in the photographs did not match the industrial-grade equipment we had installed. I grabbed my tools and went straight to the main barn. The corporate retreat was scheduled to begin in less than 3 days. If we had to cancel, the breach of contract penalty would entirely bankrupt the estate's operating account. The board of trustees would be forced to liquidate Oakhaven to cover the debts. And in a liquidation sale, Yvonne would receive a massive, unencumbered cash buyout, freeing her from the restrictive covenants of the family trust and leaving Clara and me with nothing. That was her new strategy. If she could not control the estate, she would force its destruction and walk away with the salvage value. I unlocked the primary electrical utility room in the basement of the barn. The air smelled faintly of ozone and heated plastic. I opened the heavy steel casing of the main breaker panel. What I found inside made my blood run cold. The pristine, heavy-duty wiring we had installed had been systematically bypassed. Someone had spliced a secondary, completely unregulated power line directly into the main feed, running it up through the ventilation shafts to create an intentional, massive power draw that was overheating the entire system. It was not just a code violation. It was a deliberate, highly technical sabotage designed to trigger a thermal overload, which would undoubtedly start a structural fire if the system was pushed to maximum capacity during a large event. I stepped back, realizing the horrifying brilliance of the plan. The fire safety report had not been entirely fabricated. The hazard was real, but it had been artificially created just hours before the inspector arrived. And because the inspection was supposedly independent, the insurance company had no reason to doubt its validity. I immediately shut down the main power feed to the commercial kitchen, isolating the sabotaged circuit to prevent an accidental ignition. I needed to find out how Yvonne had orchestrated this without arousing suspicion. She did not possess the technical knowledge to bypass a commercial electrical grid, nor did she have the physical strength to manipulate the heavy copper wiring. She had hired someone, and she had done it recently, right under my nose, despite being stripped of her operational authority. I went back to my workshop and accessed the security server. Since the incident with the nursery, I had not only maintained the camera network, but quietly upgraded it, installing high-definition lenses with advanced motion tracking along the service roads and delivery bays. I began scrubbing through the footage from the past 2 weeks, cross-referencing the timestamps with the dates listed on the fraudulent fire safety report. It took 5 hours of meticulous review, but I found the anomaly. 12 days ago, during a busy Tuesday afternoon when Clara and I were off the property taking Harrison to a pediatrician appointment, a generic white utility van had pulled up to the rear loading dock of the main barn. The driver, a man in unmarked grey coveralls, had carried a heavy tool bag directly into the electrical utility room. He had been granted access by someone holding a master override key card for the electronic locks on the commercial doors. I zoomed in on the footage of the electronic keypad. The system logs for that specific day confirmed that the door was opened using a legacy access code. It was a code that had been assigned to the estate's previous general manager, a man who had retired 5 years ago. I knew for a fact that those legacy codes had been purged from the system during our security overhaul. Only someone with deep administrative access to the venue's legacy software could have reactivated it. Yvonne had lost her board voting rights, but she had spent the last decade using the West Wing as her personal command center. She still had physical access to the old servers stored in the basement archives beneath her suite. She had bypassed the physical locks by resurrecting digital ghosts, hiring a rogue contractor to plant a ticking time bomb in our infrastructure, and then anonymously tipping off a fire safety inspector to ensure the hazard was officially documented. It was a perfectly insulated sequence of destruction. I needed Marcus again. I called him immediately and explained the situation. He arrived within the hour, bringing a certified forensic electrician with him. They spent the entire night documenting the sabotage, taking high-resolution photographs of the spliced wires, the bypassed breakers, and the thermal scoring. They drafted a comprehensive, sworn technical affidavit, proving that the electrical system had been recently and intentionally vandalized, entirely distinct from the original, permitted installation. But technical proof was not enough. To permanently stop Yvonne and protect the estate from liquidation, I needed to connect her directly to the contractor in the white van. I needed the financial trail. I knew that a job this dangerous and highly specialized was not done for cheap, and it certainly wasn't done on credit. Yvonne had to have paid him. I remembered a passing complaint Clara had made a few weeks prior. She had mentioned that the postal carrier had accidentally mixed up our mail with the West Wing's deliveries. Clara had found a stack of Yvonne's bank statements, mixed in with our vendor invoices. At the time, she had simply walked them over to the West Wing and left them on Yvonne's doorstep, respecting her privacy. But Clara had a photographic memory for numbers, a skill honed by years of managing the estate's complex ledgers. I found Clara in the kitchen, feeding Harrison his breakfast. I asked her if she remembered anything unusual about the envelopes she had returned to Yvonne. Clara paused, a spoonful of oatmeal hovering in the air. She frowned, her eyes narrowing as she mentally retrieved the memory. She told me that one of the envelopes was not a standard bank statement. It was a receipt of wire transfer from an offshore holding account, a financial instrument typically used to bypass domestic tax audits. More importantly, she remembered the logo faintly visible through the security envelope. It was the crest of the same boutique financial firm that employed the two external trustees on our board. Yvonne was not just sabotaging the property, she was actively colluding with the financial stewards of the trust to hide the money she was using to destroy us. The board was compromised. The very people who were supposed to protect the estate's legacy were quietly helping her dismantle it for a cut of the liquidation profits. The realization hit me like a physical blow. The safety we had built for Harrison was surrounded by a much deeper, more insidious rot than a simple family rivalry. We were not just fighting a bitter sister anymore, we were fighting the entire financial apparatus of the trust itself. The realization that the trust's financial stewards were actively engineering our ruin forced a brutal shift in my perspective. We were no longer defending a family legacy, we were trapped in a corporate hostile takeover disguised as sibling rivalry. With less than 48 hours before the tech firm's corporate retreat was scheduled to begin, there was no time for legal injunctions or slow administrative appeals. If the event was cancelled, the estate would default, the board would liquidate the property, and Yvonne and the trustees would divide the ashes. I had to secure the physical venue first, and the cost of that survival was going to be entirely on me. I liquidated my personal business accounts. Every dollar Clara and I had saved for Harrison's future, every reserve fund from my architectural restoration company, was drained in a single morning. I used the cash to hire Marcus and his entire commercial electrical crew at emergency triple overtime rates. We locked the doors to the main barn and worked continuously for 36 hours. We ripped the compromised, hazardous wiring out of the ventilation shafts with our bare hands, cutting away the burned conduits and pulling hundreds of feet of heavy-duty, industrial-grade copper to rebuild the grid from scratch. It was the most exhausting, grueling labor of my life. My hands were blistered and bleeding, and my lungs burned from the lingering ozone, but by dawn of the second day, the new system was flawless. The county fire inspector returned 4 hours before the first corporate guests arrived. He meticulously tested the loads, scrutinized the new panels, and officially signed off on the venue's safety compliance. The estate was physically secure, but Clara and I were now functionally bankrupt. I had sacrificed my independent career and our financial safety net to buy us a narrow window of leverage. While I was in the basement pulling copper wire, Clara had been in our home office pulling digital ledgers. She knew that proving Yvonne hired a rogue contractor wasn't enough. We needed to prove the trustees had funded the sabotage. Clara bypassed the current operating accounts and dug into the archived vendor payouts authorized exclusively by the two external board members over the past year. Because of her deep, historical knowledge of the estate's daily operations, she immediately spotted the anomalies. Clara discovered a series of heavily inflated recurring invoices paid to a shell landscaping procurement company for thousands of tons of non-existent topsoil and heavy machinery rentals. The venue had never received these materials. Clara traced the routing numbers on those specific invoices. They did not lead to a local agricultural supplier. They led directly to the offshore subsidiary of the boutique financial firm that employed our trustees. They had been systematically embezzling Oakhaven's operating revenue, funneling it through the shell company, and distributing a cut to Yvonne's private accounts. Yvonne had then used that stolen estate money to pay the rogue contractor to destroy the electrical grid. The trust was literally financing its own demolition. The corporate retreat went flawlessly. The electrical grid handled the massive power draw without a single fluctuation. On Monday morning, the tech firm checked out, and their final massive payment cleared our operating account, officially pulling the estate out of default territory. An hour later, Clara and I called an emergency, mandatory board of directors meeting. We did not host it in the comfortable wood-paneled boardroom. We held it in the stark concrete basement utility room of the main event barn, standing directly in front of the massive new electrical panels I had just installed. Yvonne arrived first, wearing a sharp coat and a confident, expectant smirk. She believed she was walking into a surrender. The two trustees arrived shortly after, holding leather-bound portfolios containing the liquidation paperwork they assumed we were finally forced to sign. I did not offer them seats. I locked the heavy steel door behind them. The hum of the new transformers filled the cold air. I handed the trustees the sworn forensic affidavit from Marcus and the county inspector, detailing the exact nature of the electrical sabotage. I included the high-definition security photographs of the white van and the digital access logs, proving Yvonne had used the resurrected legacy code to let the contractor inside. Yvonne's smirk faltered, but she quickly masked it with indignity, preparing to argue that digital logs could be manipulated and that we had no proof she paid for anything. She never got the chance to speak. Clara stepped forward and handed the trustees a thick, heavily tabbed binder. Clara did not raise her voice. She spoke with the cold, absolute precision of an accountant who had caught a thief. She walked them through the phantom landscaping invoices, the matching offshore routing numbers, and the undeniable trail of embezzlement connecting their firm to Yvonne's sabotage. Clara informed them that she had spent the morning uploading the entire forensic audit, along with the electrical sabotage report, to a secure cloud server. She had already drafted an email containing the decryption keys, addressed to the State Financial Regulatory Commission, the County District Attorney's Corporate Fraud Division, and the senior partners of their own boutique firm. She told them the email was scheduled to send automatically in exactly 1 hour. The color drained from the faces of the trustees. The arrogant posture they had maintained for years vanished in an instant. They were looking at the total destruction of their careers, federal prison sentences for wire fraud, and the permanent revocation of their fiduciary licenses. Yvonne looked between the men, waiting for them to deploy some legal maneuver to protect her. But self-preservation is a ruthless instinct. They didn't even look at her. Clara gave them one alternative. She placed a single legally binding document on the metal casing of a transformer. It was a complete, irrevocable dissolution of the Oakhaven Family Trust. It outlined the immediate resignation of both trustees, the restructuring of the LLC to grant Clara absolute, unencumbered ownership of the entire 90-acre estate, and a formal board resolution voiding Yvonne's lifetime residency clause due to documented malicious endangerment of a commercial property. If they signed it, Clara would delete the scheduled email. If they refused, they would leave the basement in handcuffs by nightfall. The silence in the utility room was absolute, broken only by the steady, powerful hum of the electricity I had bled to secure. The senior trustee reached into his coat, pulled out a heavy silver pen, and signed the dissolution without reading a single paragraph. The second trustee did the same. Yvonne finally broke. She stepped toward Clara, her voice trembling with a chaotic mix of rage and panic, demanding to know how we could steal her legacy, her home, and her grandfather's name. Clara looked at her sister with a terrifying, exhausted calm. She told Yvonne that a legacy is built, not inherited, and that the only thing Yvonne had ever built was a trap she finally stepped in herself. The trustees left the property immediately. Yvonne was given 48 hours to pack her belongings and vacate the West Wing. She threatened lawsuits, she threatened the press, but without the embezzled funds and the protection of the trust, she had no leverage. 2 days later, a moving truck pulled down the gravel driveway, carrying Yvonne and her hollow entitlement away from Oakhaven for good. It has been 6 months since the trust was dissolved. The financial recovery has been brutal. Clara and I are managing a staggering amount of debt from the emergency repairs, and my restoration business is entirely gone. I am back to doing the manual labor on the estate myself, working 16-hour days just to keep our heads above water. But the air in the house is different now. The suffocating pressure of surveillance and sabotage has evaporated. The estate belongs to us, and more importantly, our family belongs to us. This morning I was in the West Wing tearing down the heavy, oppressive velvet drapes Yvonne had left behind in her old suite. The morning light poured into the room, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. We are converting the space into a public gallery for local artists to generate extra revenue. I heard footsteps echoing down the hardwood hallway. Clara walked in, carrying 2 mugs of coffee. Harrison was walking unsteadily beside her. Clutching the small wooden toy hammer I had made for him, he waddled over to the freshly stripped window frame, raised his hammer, and gave the wood a gentle, determined tap. I knelt down beside him, showing him how to hold it steady. We are starting from the bottom again, rebuilding the foundation piece by piece, but this time, every nail we drive belongs entirely to us.
Editor. The infographic presents the conflict at Oakhaven as more than a dispute over inheritance. At its center is a family trying to create safety, belonging, and stability for an adopted child while another family member turns legacy into a weapon. Clara and her husband spend years restoring the estate and rebuilding a place that was physically and financially collapsing. Their work represents patience, responsibility, and commitment. When they choose the name Harrison Vance for their son, they do so to honor the kindness of Clara's grandfather. Yvonne, however, interprets the same name as a symbol of ownership and control. This difference reveals the main psychological conflict. For Clara and her husband, legacy means care, work, and emotional connection. For Yvonne, it means status, authority, and entitlement. Her reaction shows how narcissistic control can transform people into obstacles. She does not see the child as a vulnerable human being who needs a permanent family. She sees him as a threat to her imagined position inside the trust. Because of that distorted perspective, she justifies dangerous behavior, first by damaging the home before the adoption inspection and later by sabotaging the estate's electrical system. The red flags in the infographic explain how toxic family power operates. Yvonne uses possessive language, disguises threats as concern, creates harm, and then tries to blame others. She also manipulates institutions that are supposed to protect people. Child welfare procedures, legal complaints, insurance reports, corporate governance, and financial systems are turned into tools of pressure. This reveals an important social issue. Wealth and respected family structures can conceal abuse because control may appear legitimate when expressed through contracts, titles, reports, and professional authority. The timeline shows that danger grows when silence protects corruption. The first sabotage is exposed through security footage, technical evidence, and expert testimony. The second crisis reveals something larger. Yvonne is not acting alone. The external trustees are participating in financial fraud and helping create conditions that could force the estate into liquidation. Their actions show how private resentment can merge with institutional corruption when people believe money and status will protect them from accountability. Clara and her husband survive because they respond strategically rather than impulsively. They document everything, seek independent evaluations, preserve digital records, audit financial transactions, and support one another under pressure. Their calm does not mean weakness. It becomes a form of resistance. Instead of fighting through emotional arguments, they build a chain of evidence strong enough to expose the sabotage and embezzlement. The final lesson is that a true legacy is not inherited through a name, a trust, or a property title. It is built through responsibility, protection, honesty, and sacrifice. The estate only becomes a real home when the corrupt structure controlling it is removed. Harrison's small wooden hammer symbolizes this new beginning. He is growing up inside a family that understands every secure foundation must be built carefully, piece by piece, through love and integrity.